Fyodor Dostoevsky, I think he's considered probably one of the greatest novelists, at least of the 19th century, and some of his works, like The Brothers Karamazov and Demons or The Possessed, however, or Crime and Punishment, especially, are considered classics in sort of modern literature across the board. Dostoevsky, like a lot of Russian and intellectuals of the time, has this early stage where he's a real radical and revolutionary. He's an atheist. He wants to participate in the revolution. He ends up getting, for different reasons I won't get into, thrown in prison and sent to hard labor. There's a certain moment he recounts where he's actually put in front of a shooting line and was about to be killed, to be shot and killed, but then they spare him at the last second. He's got a whole journal entry about this and what that did to him. And through fits and starts, he ends up embracing something like Orthodox Christianity of his motherland. And so he's a great novelist. He's an incredible, I think, spiritual thinker in his own right. It comes through in all of the novels. And I'm no Dostoevsky expert, but I heard when I was in my younger 20s or early 20s that Rowan Williams had read all of Dostoevsky when he was in his early 20s. So I thought, well, I'm going to do that. So I read almost all of Dostoevsky, with the exception of some short stories that I still need to get to. But and you can tell throughout all of his works that almost always, especially in the major novels, the really long novels that are sometimes tough to get through, you'll have like a starets figure that's like an elder, or like Elder Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov, who is kind of this, outside of the world and outside of the daily humdrum of life. Like, they live literally in the monastery, but also welcome visitors and people seeking counsel and prayer or confession or whatever. And so there's this kind of dynamic of exterior, those on the exterior, and then those of us in the interior. And there's this kind of spiritually fruitful encounter, divine wisdom kind of interacting with human foolishness. And so there's always a figure like that. And in fact, one of the most controversial chapters that Dostoevsky ever wrote was a conversation in the book called Demons between Father Tikhon, another elder figure who lives in a monastery, who's very wise and spiritual, and then the book's main antagonist, Stavrogan. And some of the stuff that they talk about in that exchange was so controversial, or sort of inappropriate for the authorities at the time, that it was actually censored and cut out of the original printing of the novel. So anyway, so Dostoevsky's a novelist and a great spiritual thinker, and a lot of different people, philosophers, have written books on him. Like especially a lot of Russian philosophers of the early 20th century, have a book on Dostoevsky every time. So philosophers have engaged him, theologians have engaged him. So that's Dostoevsky, I think, in at least in a nutshell. There's much more that can be said. But do I think Dostoevsky was a universalist? I do think he was. But Dostoevsky also has, and in this way, he's been linked with Kierkegaard. He also has a very keen, as you would expect, I think, from an author, right, and a novelist, he has a very keen sense of the existential weight of actions and suffering, and of plot, you might say, and of drama and tragedy. And so one thing I wonder, here I'm sort of just giving my own opinion. Dostoevsky, there's a few obstacles to trying to get at what Dostoevsky thinks about anything. One is, as the, I think, famous literary critic Bakhtin wrote of Dostoevsky, his sort of polyphonic way. Like, Dostoevsky, partly what makes him a great novelist is that he fully develops his characters to such an extent, even though they are representing all these different viewpoints. He doesn't resolve. He doesn't come in with the authorial voice and resolve and say, this is the right way, this person's evil and bad and wrong. I mean, you can usually get a sense for who's evil and who's not, but everybody's complicated. And so you're not going to find just one character in a Dostoevsky novel and say, oh, that's what Dostoevsky thinks. That's his view on whatever. And so you got a lot of different characters. Let's take, for example, Brothers Karamazov. I mean, you've got Alyosha, who's often just his very presence, even though he's often silent before accusations and questions of spiritual weightiness. He's, he's also the most innocent, you can tell. He's the younger brother. But then you got Ivan, the older brother, an older brother who's intellectual. And he's, I think one of the most famous chapters, Ivan's rebellion in that book. That's where Ivan raises the question. In fact, he raises the question of evil, but he does so in a universalist mode. And he says, let's assume that everything will be reconciled in the end. Let's assume that universal salvation, or abokatasis, doesn't say abokatasis, but pretty much abokatasis is true. Like, that's actually the way it's all going to end. And then he goes through famously all of these horrible incidents, war crimes, soldiers throwing up babies, catching them on on bayonets at the end of their guns. Just creative evil is what you might call it. Like, it's not just that it's evil, but it's actually so thoughtful. That adds to the kind of horrific, the terrifying sense of evil. We're not just evil human beings are or can be, but where we differ from beasts, you might say, is that we don't just do violence, but we can do it artfully. So we can be artful in good and beauty, the different sort of forms of art we bring into the world, but we can be artful and intelligent and rational even in our evil acts. And so Ivan famously brings up all of these different instances, and also famously, Dostoevsky, these instances that he's putting in the mouth of Ivan in the novel are actually ones he knew of and got from newspapers. So they're not even stuff he made up. There's stuff that actually happened or he read about in newspapers. So he's putting all this in the mouth of Ivan, the older brother, one of the older brothers in that family. And Ivan's whole rebellion, his whole point is, would universal restoration really still make any of this worth it? Was it worth it for this young child, again, a story Dostoevsky actually read about, whose parents would punish her every time she did something a little bit wrong or against the rules that they'd set, by making her stay in the outhouse with human excrement in her mouth in the cold weather in Russia, through the whole night as a punishment for doing something, minor wrong, some sort of minor infraction. And like her tears, I think one of the most moving parts, her tears, like, what was the salvation of the whole world, universal reconciliation, was that worth even one tear that she shed in those moments, right? Why am I bringing this up? Because Dostoevsky wrote this and thought through all this and has this character who's actually mounting, I think, one of the most important objections, not just to universalism, but to what I consider the best version of Christianity, a universalist one, and still saying, I would still reject the great, resolution and great absolute reconciliation among all beings. I would reject creation itself. I would reject this whole project that God has embarked on, even if he's going to eventually win over everybody. It wasn't worth the evil and the tragedy that occurred and the suffering that occurred in the meantime, right, in the middle of the plot. And so you have that character, and then famously people talk about and there's all these discussions and debates, but Father Zosima in the latter part of the book, he's got this sort of 3-chapter discourse, which does include a pretty clear teaching of universalism and the remedial fires of hell, and how these are meant to purify every soul, and we'll come back to, and they will, return to God. This is a part of our repentance. Also famously, in different parts of Dostoevsky's writings, you have a moment where a character will get this profound joy for all of creation. Alyosha and Brothers K falls down, kisses the earth, and you've got these moments where characters realize, actually, we're all together, we're all united, we all sort of, we're all responsible for one another, and so we're all linked. And so it's kind of like we're all saved, or none of us are saved. So you've got this dialogue within Dostoevsky's own work. And what I think, that doesn't mean that Dostoevsky himself is sort of uncertain or wavering about whether or not universalism is true. I think what he's trying to do is ensure, partly one of the things he's trying to do is ensure that our universalism isn't cheap, that it doesn't therefore become a kind of justification for turning your eyes away from the real horrors of the world as we currently know it. right? So there's that sense and attention, that keenness, that attentiveness to the real suffering and evil that happens all around us all the time. I don't think Dostoevsky himself actually ever even wants or tries to resolve that. You know, for him, you have the universalist picture represented by someone like Father Zosima, or by the way, a lesser known maybe text, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. At the very end of that, he's got the main character there who's had all these dreams and was going to commit suicide but doesn't, and so forth. And there's that whole story ends with this kind of reconciliation between him and this little girl. But he says there's a line there that where the author said, or the narrator says, if we all just loved each other as we love ourselves, everything could be arranged and made right in 1 hour. He said in just a single hour, everything could be made right. So there's this sort of elated moment of like, that's the hope, and it's something that surely will come to pass. So I think Dostoevsky has that universalist, profound and confident hope. I think he really does. And in that way, I would say Father Zosima does represent his discourses in Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's like technical view or like final word to that. But he also has Ivan, the side, you know, as one of his sides that says, but that doesn't mean we have thereby explained the suffering and the torture and the tragedy all around us. And we have to somehow see that these two are in tension and allow them to kind of inform one another while holding both, you know, in our mind's eye and before us at the same time. So I think that's what I would say about Dostoevsky and his complicated, but I think ultimately fairly clear views on the issue.